Hey y'all, Carolina Tony here. Today the road brings me to the Badlands National Park, and right outside the National Park is a Prairie Homestead, the former home of Mr. and Mrs. Ed Brown from around 1909. Today we are going to learn a little bit about Mr. and Mrs. Ed Brown and their Prairie Homestead. We'll get started right after this station identification. The Homestead Act of May the 20th, 1862, a person who had reached the age of 21 could file on 160 acres of land for $18. The homesteader had to build a house, plow a small acreage for crops, and establish a residence for 5 years in order to receive ownership or prove up. A common remark by homesteaders was that the government bet you 160 acres of land against $18 that you'll starve to death before you live on your land for 5 years. You see, this home is built into the side of the hill, and a lot of it's covered with dirt. Oh boy. Notice the floor is dirt.
Welcome to the home of Mr. and Mrs. Ed Brown. In the fall of 1909, Mr. and Mrs. Brown and their bachelor son Charles migrated from eastern Nebraska by covered wagon to homestead this 160 acres. Arriving late in the fall, they immediately began to build the dugout portion of their home. They started by digging out the kitchen and bedroom portion. The next step was to cut down the cottonwood trees from the draw in front of the house and lay up the beams in the front of the dugout. A trip now had to be made south to the White River with team and wagon to get the slabs to cover the beams. As soon as the slabs were in place, 6 to 8 inches of dirt was shoveled over the roof. 2 small boards and 2 pieces of building paper served as a room divider between the kitchen and bedroom. This was their completed home. In a few years, the dugout walls began to cave in, and the boards were placed around the perimeter of the 2 rooms. By the next year, the sod walls as well as the boards were covered with a calcimine-like material from the Badlands, with which the boards are now painted. As the years went by, the walls were covered with various types of material, and then wallpapered. The frame room was added in 1913. It was a deserted homestead shack from nearby which Mr. Brown moved in. The kitchen stove, table, washstand, and shelves are original equipment. The remainder of the furniture is typical of that used by Mr. and Mrs. Brown, as well as other people in the area. The log front on this building was quite unusual, as most dugouts would have had a sod front. When the frame room was added, siding boards were placed over the log front to give an appearance of the same type of construction. The 1909 date may seem quite recent to you, but this area was not settled until after 1900. The Homestead Act was passed in 1862, and the first homesteads were taken out in eastern Nebraska and eastern South Dakota. It took many years before the settlers moved this far west. This area was surveyed in 1892, 2 years after the last Indian battle, the Wounded Knee Massacre, which took place about 60 miles southwest of here in 1890. The first homesteads were filed for in Jackson County at the turn of the century. The largest number of homesteads filed for in any one year in all the western states was in 1913. The last homestead was filed for in this county in 1935. However, by 1918, most every 160 acres had been filed for, and most of the homesteaders were living in their claims. Crop failure and hard times in general forced many people to abandon their land early, but when the drought and depression of the 1930s came, it forced all but the most stubborn ones off the land. Conditions such as hard times, drought, grasshoppers, and other disasters, as well as the machinery, household furnishings, and general living conditions were very much the same throughout the plains from 1850 through the 1930s. If your grandparents, or maybe Aunt Nellie, homesteaded any place from Canada to Mexico, there would have undoubtedly been a lot of similarity between their home and this home of Mr. and Mrs. Brown.
Here is a root cellar, mainly used for food storage and safety from severe storms. And I would imagine tornadoes are a big thing out here on the prairie. This is the outhouse. It says equipment in the outhouse consisted of a Sears and Roebuck catalog. Whoa, shit. I wasn't expecting that. This was the acreage. This acreage was a land that Mr. Brown farmed to prove up his homestead to acquire ownership. A lot of things he had to contend with was drought, storms, grasshoppers, and prairie dogs. They are everywhere. This is the chicken coop, and you see it's built into the side of the hillside as well to protect the chickens from the weather as well as predators, because there are predators out here on the prairie. This is called an agricultural boiler. It was typically shared by neighbors to render hogs, scald chickens, or wash heavy bedding. This is something that would have been ordered and shipped in by wagon. Homesteading on the prairie, water was a big problem. This well was dug 30 feet by hand, and many of the wells went dry. In later years, this one furnished only a few buckets of water a day. This is an old Ford. And where he would keep his cows, or maybe a horse if he had one. And perhaps a little protected corral for his livestock. Well, that is going to do it for our trip to the prairie home of Mr. and Mrs. Ed Brown. Surprisingly, someone lived in this home until the 1940s. Pretty interesting, I think. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give me a big old thumbs up. Be sure to share with your family and friends. But until next time, y'all have a good day.